The harsh Wyoming wind howled across the plains, rattling the loose boards of Samuel Thornton's lonely ranch house. At 45, Samuel's weathered face told stories of countless winters and unforgiving summers spent building his cattle empire from nothing. His calloused hands gripped a tin cup of black coffee as he stared out across his land. 5,000 acres stretching toward the distant mountains. Hundreds of cattle grazing on the spring grass. All his, and yet, in the quiet moments before dawn, the emptiness of the house behind him made his accomplishments taste like dust. No laughter filled these rooms. No conversation broke the silence of his evenings. And despite his considerable wealth in livestock and land, Samuel felt poorer than when he'd first arrived with nothing but a horse and determination 20 years ago. I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today? The letter sat unopened on the rough-hewn table, the third correspondence from Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell of Denver, a widow with 2 young children seeking a new beginning. Samuel had placed an advertisement in newspapers across 3 states. Successful cattle rancher seeks bride. Comfortable home, ample provisions, and 50 head of cattle offered as dowry to a suitable woman willing to relocate to Wyoming territory. The proposition had been businessman-like, practical, just as Samuel approached everything in life. He had received 12 responses, exchanged letters with 5 women, but only Eleanor's words had stirred something beyond practicality in him, a sense that perhaps she wasn't simply looking for security, but for a partner in building something meaningful. Her latest letter had arrived yesterday, and he'd been finding excuses not to open it. Afraid of disappointment, afraid of hope. "Gettin' soft in your old age," Samuel muttered to himself as he finally broke the seal on the envelope. Eleanor had accepted his invitation to visit the ranch with her children, James 8 and Sarah 6. She wrote that she wanted them to see what might become their home before making any final decisions. Samuel folded the letter carefully, considering the implications. He'd need to prepare the unused bedroom, maybe add curtains to the windows, perhaps even attempt to make the Stark ranch house more welcoming. These thoughts troubled him as he saddled his horse and rode out to check on the herd, wondering what a city woman and 2 young children would make of the isolation, the work, the reality of ranch life so far from the comforts of Denver. The stagecoach arrived 2 weeks later, stirring up clouds of dust visible from miles away. Samuel stood awkwardly on the porch of his freshly swept house, wearing his only clean shirt and feeling foolish for the wildflowers he'd gathered in a jar on the table inside. The coach creaked to a halt, and for a moment, Samuel considered mounting his horse and disappearing into the hills. Then the door opened, and Eleanor Mitchell stepped down, a woman in her mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled back sensibly, wearing a travel-worn but well-made blue dress. Her face showed the strain of the journey, but held a determined set to her jaw that Samuel immediately recognized as familiar. The same expression he saw in his own reflection when facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. "Mr. Thornton," she greeted him with a direct gaze and a slight nod, neither overly familiar nor coldly distant. "Thank you for your invitation. May I present my children, James and Sarah." The children emerged from the coach, the boy standing protectively close to his mother, while the little girl peered at Samuel with undisguised curiosity. "Children, this is Mr. Thornton, whose ranch we've come to visit." Samuel removed his hat, suddenly aware of every line on his face, every gray strand in his dark hair, every callus on his extended hand. Mrs. Mitchell, James, Sarah, welcome to Thornton Ranch. The journey must have been tiring. Please, come inside where it's cooler, and I've prepared some refreshments. The first days passed in awkward politeness, Samuel showing them around the property, explaining the workings of the ranch, watching closely for signs of disappointment or regret in Eleanor's expressions. The children gradually warmed to the novelty of ranch life, especially after Samuel introduced them to a gentle mare and a newborn calf. James followed Samuel around with increasing interest, asking endless questions about cattle and horses, while little Sarah developed a fascination with the chickens Samuel kept for eggs. Eleanor herself remained more difficult to read, her practical nature evident in her questions about water sources, winter conditions, and the proximity of the nearest town and school. The children's education is paramount, she stated simply, watching Samuel's reaction carefully. There's a schoolhouse 15 miles east, Samuel replied, his mind already calculating how to manage daily transportation for the children. Or, he hesitated, I have books, quite a few of them. I taught myself most of what I know through reading, and I'd be willing to help with their lessons until more permanent arrangements could be made. Eleanor's expression softened slightly at this, and Samuel felt a small measure of hope. That evening, when the children had been put to bed in the spare room, Samuel and Eleanor sat on the porch in the cooling air, the vast starlit sky stretching above them. My husband died in a mining accident 3 years ago, Eleanor said quietly. He left us with debts and few prospects in Denver. Your advertisement seemed practical. It was meant to be, Samuel admitted, uncomfortable with the directness of their conversation, but sensing its necessity. I built this ranch from nothing, Mrs. Mitchell. I can provide security for you and your children, a home, food, and a future. The 50 head of cattle I mentioned would be yours alone, your property to keep regardless of other arrangements. He stumbled over the implication of marriage, finding himself unexpectedly nervous. I'm not a particularly refined man, but I'm honest and hard-working. I would treat your children as my own and ensure they never wanted for anything within my power to provide. Eleanor studied him in the dim light from the lantern hanging beside the door. And what do you want in return, Mr. Thornton? Besides a housekeeper and a mother for children you don't yet have? The question caught Samuel off guard, its bluntness stripping away the business-like veneer of their arrangement. Companionship, he finally said, the words sounding small against the vastness of the night. Someone to share the work and the rewards, the good years and the bad. Someone who might, in time, find some measure of contentment here, as I have. He looked away, embarrassed by his candor. I'm not asking for love, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm too old and too practical for such notions. But perhaps mutual respect and shared purpose might be enough to build a life upon. Eleanor was silent for so long that Samuel feared he'd offended her, but when she finally spoke, her voice held no reproach. I believe it might, Mr. Thornton, but my children must agree to this arrangement as well. Their happiness is my primary concern. A week into their visit, disaster struck the ranch. A violent spring storm blew in from the mountains, bringing hail that scattered the cattle and lightning that sparked a fire in the south pasture. Samuel rode out with his 2 ranch hands to save what cattle they could and contain the fire before it reached the main house. Eleanor and the children watched in alarm as the men rode out into the deluge, the sky black with storm clouds despite the early hour. Hours passed with no sign of their return, and as the storm intensified, Eleanor made a decision. She dressed the children warmly, instructed James to help her, and set out for the barn where she'd harness Samuel's wagon. "Mother, what are you doing?" James asked, his young face serious with concern. "Mr. Thornton may need help," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "We're going to bring supplies to the south pasture." Through driving rain and treacherous mud, Eleanor navigated the wagon toward the distant glow of flames, the children huddled under oilcloths beside her. They found Samuel and his men fighting a losing battle against the fire, exhausted and soaked to the skin. The sight of the wagon approaching through the storm stopped Samuel in his tracks, disbelief and then anger crossing his face as he recognized Eleanor at the reins. "What in God's name are you doing out here? It's dangerous," he shouted as he reached the wagon. "You've brought blankets, food, and water," Eleanor observed calmly, ignoring his outburst. "And another pair of hands. James, stay with your sister in the wagon. Mr. Thornton, tell me what needs to be done." For hours they worked side by side, digging fire breaks and moving cattle to safety. Eleanor's city clothes caked with mud, her hands blistered from the unfamiliar work, but her determination unwavering. When the fire was finally contained and the immediate danger had passed, Samuel found himself looking at Eleanor with new eyes. She stood in the rain-soaked field, exhausted but unbowed, helping James tend to a calf that had been separated from its mother. Something shifted in Samuel's chest, a recognition that went beyond admiration for her practical help. This woman had courage and strength that matched the demands of ranch life, not despite her concern for her children, but because of it. She had come to their aid not as a helpless city woman, but as a potential partner in the truest sense. The journey back to the ranch house was made in weary silence, all of them soaked and smoke-stained. Once inside, Eleanor efficiently organized hot baths for the children, tended to minor burns on one of the ranch hands, and prepared a simple but hearty meal from what she found in Samuel's kitchen. Samuel watched her move through his house with competence and care, transforming the utilitarian space into something that felt, for the first time, like a home. After the children were asleep and the ranch hands had returned to their bunkhouse, Samuel found Eleanor at the kitchen table, finally attending to her own blistered hands. Without a word, he sat across from her, gently took her hands in his, and began applying salve to the raw skin. "You could have been killed today," he said quietly, his rough voice betraying more emotion than he intended. "You and the children." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "We could have, but so could you. That's the reality of this life, isn't it? The dangers and the hardships?" Her directness caught him off guard again. "Yes," he admitted. "It's not an easy life. Today was unusually difficult, but there will be other challenges. Blizzards, drought, disease in the herd." He hesitated, then added, "I wouldn't blame you for deciding it's too much, especially with the children to consider." Eleanor was silent for a moment, looking down at their hands, his large and weathered, wrapped carefully around her smaller ones. The children need stability and safety, yes, but they also need to learn about courage and perseverance, about building something worthwhile, even when it's difficult. The next morning, Samuel found James already in the barn, awkwardly attempting to lift a saddle onto the gentle mare Samuel had introduced him to. "Would you like some help with that?" Samuel asked, careful not to embarrass the boy by taking over. James nodded, a determined set to his young jaw. "I want to learn how to ride properly. If we're going to live here, I need to be able to help with the cattle." The casual certainty in the boy's words, "if we're going to live here," caught Samuel by surprise. "Have you and your mother discussed staying then?" he asked, keeping his tone deliberately light as he showed James how to position the saddle blanket. James shrugged. She said we need to talk about it as a family, but I heard her telling Sarah that you would be a good father. Sarah's worried you don't smile enough, though. Samuel couldn't help the laugh that escaped him. The sound strange in the quiet barn. Your sister is observant, he acknowledged. I haven't had much cause for smiling living alone. Perhaps that would change with company at my table. James studied him with serious eyes. Do you really want us to stay? All of us, I mean? Or just Mother? The directness of the question, so similar to Eleanor's forthrightness, demanded an honest answer. All of you, Samuel said simply. I've built this ranch with my own hands, James. It's a good life, but a lonely one. Your mother is a remarkable woman, and you and Sarah are fine children. Having the three of you here would make this place more than just a successful ranch. It would make it a home. That evening, Samuel invited Eleanor and the children to join him on a ride to a special place on his property, a hill overlooking the entire ranch, where the sunset painted the landscape in bold and crimson. He helped Sarah onto the saddle in front of him, while James proudly rode the gentle mare, with Eleanor on a sturdy gelding beside them. As they reached the hilltop, Samuel pointed out landmarks across his land, the creek that never ran dry, even in drought, the protected valley where the cattle wintered, the distant outline of the mountains that shielded them from the worst of the northern storms. It's beautiful, Eleanor said softly, her eyes taking in the vastness of what could become her home. Sarah, perched in front of Samuel, reached up to touch his bearded cheek, drawing his attention down to her solemn little face. If we stay, will you be our papa? She asked with a child's directness that left no room for evasion. Samuel felt something catch in his throat, emotion he wasn't accustomed to dealing with. He looked over Sarah's head to Eleanor, seeking guidance, permission. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she gave him a small nod. I would be honored to be your papa, Sarah, Samuel said carefully, if that's what you and your brother and your mother decide you want. The little girl considered this with grave seriousness. I think we do, but you have to promise to smile more, and to teach me to ride my own horse someday, not just sit with you. The promise of 50 head of cattle had brought Eleanor Mitchell to Samuel Thornton's ranch, a practical arrangement between two practical people. But as they sat on the hilltop, watching the sunset, with Sarah's small hand trustingly in his, and James earnestly pointing out a hawk circling above them, Samuel realized that he had been calculating wealth all wrong. The true measure wasn't in acres or cattle or the gold in the bank in town. It was in the trust of a child, the courage of a woman who would drive a wagon into a storm to bring help, the possibility of a family gathered around his table every evening for years to come. I think, Samuel said quietly to Eleanor as they rode back to the ranch house in the gathering twilight, that I am getting the far better end of our bargain. 3 months later, on a clear summer day, Eleanor Mitchell became Eleanor Thornton in a simple ceremony in the town church, with James standing proudly at Samuel's side and Sarah scattering wildflowers before her mother. True to his word, Samuel signed over 50 of his best cattle to Eleanor's name, the bill of sale witnessed by the town lawyer. But that night, as they sat on the porch of what was now truly their home, Eleanor handed him a folded document. "What's this?" Samuel asked, puzzled by the formal paper. "The wedding gift," Eleanor replied, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I've transferred ownership of those cattle back to the ranch, our ranch. We'll build this legacy together, Samuel, not as separate entities with separate property." Through the open window behind them came the sound of James reading a story aloud to Sarah, their voices drifting into the evening air. Samuel looked at the document, then at his wife, feeling a fullness in his chest that had nothing to do with cattle or land or any material measure of success. "I came west with nothing," he said softly. "Built a ranch worth bragging about, and thought that was all I needed. How wrong I was." He reached for Eleanor's hand, his touch gentler than it had been that night after the fire, but with the same care and promise. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton. All the cattle in Wyoming couldn't equal the wealth you and those children have brought to my table." Samuel Thornton's cattle ranch flourished in the years that followed, expanding and prospering under the joint stewardship of Samuel and Eleanor. James grew into a young man with his stepfather's knowledge of ranching and his mother's steady courage, while Sarah developed a remarkable talent for handling even the most difficult horses. The once empty house filled with voices, laughter, and occasionally heated debates as the family faced the challenges of ranch life together. And if the townsfolk noticed that the once stern and solitary rancher now smiled more readily and spoke with pride of his children's accomplishments rather than his cattle holdings, they recognized it as the natural transformation of a man who had discovered that true wealth couldn't be counted in livestock or gold, but in the lives intertwined with his own around a family table.